My name is Brian Krever. I am the Deputy Chief of the Environment Branch for Renewable Energy within the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. You may heard of us referred to that way. We are a bureau within the Department of the Interior, and we handle mineral extraction, energy development on the Outer Continental Shelf, which is anywhere from 3 nautical miles out to 200 nautical miles offshore. And in the Gulf of Mexico, we do a lot of oil and gas development, as well as in Alaska. And if you have ever had a sand beach renourishment project done, and the sand has come from anywhere over 3 miles offshore, that has been the involvement of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the Army Corps of Engineers. But what we're here to talk about today is offshore wind development, which primarily has been happening on the Atlantic coast, although we do have leases now off of California and a scheduled lease sale off of in the Gulf of Mexico as well. So this is what we call our rainbow graphic, and it is our planning and development process for the renewable energy program. And it starts with planning and analysis, goes on to leasing, site assessment, and then construction and operations. And you can see where we are today. So we are right after a lease has been issued, and we are right before the site assessment and surveys part, which is where surveys are done to determine what the bottom looks like and what would be feasible for a project in the area. And there was a large process that occurred before we got here to get us here. And that began even before 2012, but that was really where the first call for information and nominations went out, which I'll go into more detail on. And it's been over 10 years to get to where we are today. And so I'll try to describe some of the activities that have happened and the stakeholder outreach and feedback we've gotten that has gotten us to where we are today. So this is a timeline showing a lot of the things that happened to get us where we are, starting back with the establishment of a renewable energy task force in North Carolina back in 2010. And those are some of the task force meetings and dates where they were held. And what a task force is it brings together federal and state officials as well as local elected officials to have everyone together to try to find out where the best areas would be for offshore wind and what issues we should be looking at in offshore wind development. So as a result of the task force, we engaged in a visual simulation study, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, and we put forward a call for information and nominations back in 2012, and that's really the beginning of the leasing process, where we look for information on interest from industry, as well as what issues that stakeholders are concerned about that we need to address before we lease areas. And I cover more of this later, but the real issues, the 2 main issues we heard about was visual impacts and navigation concerns. And so there were several studies that we did to try to address those concerns. And then in August of 2014, we identified areas that we felt were most suitable for leasing. And for those areas, we published an environmental assessment to look at the impacts of actually issuing a lease, not actual construction of a project, but issuing a lease and allowing surveys to occur. And that was back in 2015 and finalized in September of 2015. So how we got to where we are today. So back when the task force was first established, we needed to decide what were those broad areas to look at and establish some planning areas. So the University of North Carolina conducted a study looking at some of the larger constraints for offshore wind development. One of them would be Department of Defense areas, so areas where the Navy needs large areas to conduct exercises, where offshore wind would be an impediment to that, or where they do low-level flights, or they may be testing bombing. And so if you're bombing an area, it's probably not a great place for offshore wind development. In addition, areas that would be low suitability for the installation of pile foundations, those were removed, as well as areas of high avian concentration and other high marine life. So around the capes were generally seen as areas where there was a lot of biodiversity and may not be appropriate for wind development, so those were removed. So this gave us our broad planning areas that back in the day were called 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But that is kind of the first step of what we're looking at as some of those broader areas. And so we began a lot of stakeholder outreach. There were 12 task force meetings between North Carolina and South Carolina. We had public meetings, many of which were down here, which I attended, public information sessions, public scoping meetings, and then visual simulation open houses where we actually took the results of our visual simulation study and rented out large spaces and had the simulations on the wall and big screens to show the video simulations to give folks an idea of what these would look like and get feedback on what they felt were acceptable distances and where they had concerns for impacts of tourism. We also had, the last joint task force was in 2021. So when we actually went out with a call for information and nominations, we only went out with areas 1, 2, and 3. And now I'm going to focus more on the Wilmington areas. So when we got comments from the public on the call for information and nominations, really we heard primarily about visual impacts, both from the National Park Service and then from coastal communities, mostly in Brunswick County. So we heard a lot from Sunset Beach, Bald Head Island, Oak Island, Bolden Beach that were concerned about potential impacts for their communities, visual impacts, nighttime impacts, as well as those impacts to tourism. We also got a lot of responses from the vessel traffic and for navigation safety, so a lot of industry groups involved in shipping. They were concerned about cargo vessels that are further offshore, as well as tug and barge traffic closer to shore and how this could impact them, and access to the Port of Wilmington. We also got some new information on shrimping and transit corridors that people use to get offshore to go fishing, and suggestions for marine mammal stipulations and information on right whales. So addressing the navigation concern, we took AIS data and worked with the Coast Guard to identify areas that may not be the best for offshore wind, try to avoid areas where there was vessel traffic, and we saw that a lot of the traffic going up and down the coast was cutting in the edge of that call area, and then there was traffic kind of going through the area directly, and then there was some vessels coming right into the traffic separation scheme out of Wilmington. So these are established transit corridors for vessels to get in and out of the port. And we wanted to make sure vessels were still able to do that. So we worked with the maritime community and the U.S. Coast Guard to come up with some options. And so we held a bunch of meetings with different industry groups and the Coast Guard. And as a result of this outreach, the Coast Guard came to us with some recommendations on what would work and keep the area navigation safe and allow for navigation to continue to occur unimpeded. So that's how we ended up here. This area was removed, and then the far off areas were removed to establish this area as what we call the Wilmington East wind energy area, and you can see that it allowed for the natural progression of ships coming out of the traffic separation scheme. And also, we had those feedback on visual impacts. So kind of our first cut at this was to remove areas within 10 nautical miles of shore and try to get a bit of a buffer from the coastal communities. So after we published our wind energy areas and those areas that we thought were more suitable for offshore wind development, we did receive additional feedback that a lot of the community felt like that was still too close to shore. They hadn't had an opportunity to comment. And so there was a long process to try to figure out exactly how to move forward. So what was actually decided, and also one other thing that happened was right whale critical habitat was established in this area going down to South Carolina, and it was established for right whale calving. So certain conditions such as water depth, sea temperature, and wind speeds that make the area more suitable for right whale calving were documented and established an area of critical habitat. Now, it doesn't mean that wind development couldn't occur there. The question would be, would wind development, with the presence of structures, interfere with those conditions that those whales need to do their calving activities? But we took the precautionary principle and decided not to develop the Wilmington West area. And also, to address the concerns we had heard about visual impacts, We moved the buffer that we had at 10 miles all the way out to over 20 miles, 20 statute miles, approximately 19 nautical miles from shore. So the area you see here is what actually ended up being leased, just the green and the blue areas. And a little bit more was removed for Coast Guard concerns, and then a little bit for DoD airspace interactions. So you can see that it just continued to evolve to what we got to today. And I'm going to hand it over to Seth for a little bit about our environmental studies.
All right, thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. My name is Seth Tierkoff. I'm the lead project coordinator for the Carolina Long Bay leases with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So yeah, I want to speak a little bit about kind of where we're at and where we're going with the Carolina Long Bay leases. So just for a little bit of additional context on our environmental studies program, BOEM has a really robust environmental studies program that's focused on funding research that really addresses key stakeholder concerns. So Brian touched on this a little bit, but we funded work to understand visual effects in terms of doing some viewshed analysis of actually what these wind farms would look like at certain distances from shore. We funded work to understand fishing, diving, and ecotourism effects. That was work with UNC's Institute of Marine Sciences in Morehead City. We supported work focused on benthic habitat and archaeological resources. That was work done by the NOAA Beaufort Laboratory in Beaufort, North Carolina. And I've also supported work focused on social values, and that was also work done by NOAA. And what's really important is that those studies are informed by stakeholder feedback in terms of what those concerns are, and those results are incorporated into our environmental analysis and planning efforts. And so Brian shared this, but really where we're at in terms of this overall process is we've got 10 years of history in terms of that planning work, but we have many years ahead of us in terms of the actual development of these projects. And so last June, the Carolina Long Bay leases were executed, and right now the lessees are working on some initial site assessment activities. And they're several years ahead in terms of this overall process. And I also want to capture that we have, sorry, the pointer's not working very well, but we have enhanced engagement requirements associated with these leases. And so these are really focused on the lessees working closely with coastal communities, documenting through progress reports that are submitted to BOEM every 6 months what that engagement is actually looking like. And those progress reports are publicly available. So the first progress report was just accepted by BOEM. It's not on our website yet, but I'm happy to share it with folks who would like access. And there are also communication plans. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's really trying to put into real terms what that engagement is going to look like with coastal communities as these efforts and plans develop. So just for a little bit of info on who the lessees actually are. The westernmost lease is held by Total Energies Renewables, as well as the easternmost lease being held by Duke Energy Renewables. Both lessees have representatives that are here today. They have a table in the lobby. I encourage you to meet with the lessees and to learn more from them about what they're doing and what their plans are. The auction was held on May 11th of last year. And just for some context around the size of these leases, they're around 110,000 acres, and if fully built out, would provide around 1.3 gigawatts of power. And that's equivalent to powering around 500,000 homes. And that's, again, if fully built out, that would be the amount of power generated. And just a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation, that would be around the amount of power to power all homes in New Hanover, Brunswick, and Pender counties and beyond. So it's a significant amount of power if built out in full scale. Some additional lease details that are relevant to everyone here. There's a bid credit process associated with this auction that resulted in a lessee commitment of $42 million of company dollars, of lessee dollars, towards two main initiatives. One focused on offshore wind workforce training programs, and another focused on development of a domestic supply chain for the offshore wind industry. And over the next several years, the expectation is that the lessees will begin to make progress towards these initiatives. So I encourage you also, if you have questions about that, to communicate, to talk with the lessees about that. And then these enhanced engagement requirements, shared a little bit about that, but that really looks like communication plans with Native American tribes, fisheries stakeholders, and agencies. Already mentioned there's these progress reports that are required every 6 months. Those are made publicly available. They'll be posted on BOEM's website relatively soon. And if you are interested, you can continue to come back to our website and have access to those progress reports. And I also want to flag that the lessees to date have been highly collaborative. We've seen both Duke Energy and TotalEnergies working closely together, partnering on different plans. And these teams are largely composed of North Carolina-based folks. So Jen Banks is the project manager for TotalEnergies. She's based in Raleigh. Spencer Haynes is the project manager for Duke Energy's lease, and he's based in Charlotte. So with that, I'll hand it back to Brian to talk a little bit about our environmental analysis process and how the public can be engaged in that.
So we've heard a lot of concerns that we're so far along in the process that there's no opportunities for involvement. But I did want to point out that there is still a lot of opportunities for involvement. We're still very early in the process, and I really wanted to point out our environmental review process for when we receive a construction and operations plan. So if we were to receive a construction operations plan, which is basically the project development plan, the project application for an offshore wind facility, we would conduct our completeness and sufficiency review to make sure that everything required in our regulations is included in the construction operation plan. We would develop a schedule with cooperating agencies. We would consult with cooperating agencies on the purpose and needs statement for the project. And the U.S. Coast Guard would review the navigation safety risk assessment. And then when we would go about publishing a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement, we'd hold a 30-day public comment period and public scoping meetings, where we're really trying to receive input from the local communities on what issues we should analyze in the document and what alternatives to the proposed action we should look at. And so that's a really the best opportunity to get any changes to the project, any alternatives that could still result in the construction of a wind energy facility, but would address some of the concerns you may have if you're a resident concerned about visual impacts or a fisherman concerned about access to the area. Proposed alternatives could be a way to alter the project in a way to make it less impactful to the resources you're concerned about. And then we would consult with our cooperating agencies on alternatives as well, to ensure that we can try to implement things that were suggested from the public, and also other agencies such as the National Marine Fisheries Service often have alternatives they want to see in there as well. Then after we've prepared the draft environmental impact statement, we publish a notice of availability in the Federal Register, and we go back out again with a 45-day public comment period, and we would come back here and hold public hearings to get information on how we've done to the draft environmental impact statement. Are the impact levels correct? Did we cover all the resources? Are there any errors in there? Did we miss a study that should be included? Really getting the public's review of that document and input. And then we'd work with our cooperating agencies to address public comments, and then we'd publish a notice of availability for the final environmental impact statement, and then eventually issue a record of decision, which would document BOEM's approval, disapproval, or approval with modifications of that project. And this whole process, from the notice of intent to the record of decision, takes approximately 24 months or 2 years. So it's a long process, and there's lots of opportunities for engagement, and we're still a ways away from getting to that point. So my message for today would be to please stay involved. We'll be back coming and asking for your input. Please provide that input, because it's the best way we can have informed decisions is from getting that information from the public, getting it into a document in front of our decision makers. So thank you so much for attending. And that's it for the presentation, but we do have our email addresses here if you have any additional questions after the meeting.